they're communicating with us. So we're about to end our little saga here, and we've heard close to 8 vocalizations. All quiet.
I never had the opportunity to meet or to get acquainted with Rene to the extent that I would have liked to have. I think I hold the dubious honor of alienating myself from him more rapidly than any other individual due to some difference of opinion. That this is quite an honor to have the last word on things. I don't get that privilege very often at home, so enjoy it in this opportunity here. And I want to express my thanks to everyone for sticking it out here to the bitter end, those of you that are still here to listen to this presentation, and for the invitation to participate in the great hospitality that's been extended. These really are like a lot like family reunions. Attended Brigham Young University for my first 2 degrees. Met my wife there. I've been married for 23 years, celebrated our anniversary last weekend at another conference where I was speaking. I have 6 boys, so my plate is very full, and I have a lot of different activities going on, as you can imagine. I apologize, too, for the confusion over the title of my topic. I kept dodging Jason's request for a title for the presentation. I was trying to work up some data based on some new evidence, or a new approach to the evidence. The Idaho Museum of Natural History finally jumped onto the pork barrel wagon and successfully got an amendment to a bill that landed us a nice chunk of change to establish a virtual imaging laboratory in the museum. And that has provided some interesting opportunities for not only imaging the footprint evidence, the footprint specimens that I'm dealing with, but ways to deal with them in a morphometric fashion. But as often happens towards the end of a semester, many other commitments and deadlines were looming, and I didn't get quite to that. And after last night's spread of a buffet of ideas, I'm glad that I ended up settling on the topic that I have. Those of you that were at the Willow Creek Museum may see some repetition here, but I hope that some of the elaborations will make it new and interesting to you, because I'm going to spend a little more time talking about the mid-tarsal break and the function of the footprints. Please, thank you. Yeah. Since I have talked a little bit about that in the past, I've noticed that more frequent reference has been made to that fact, or to that aspect of the footprint function. And I want to just review a little bit of that so that it's quite clear what it is that I'm referring to. Is it a shameless self-promotion when you talk about a book that hasn't been published yet? I've been asked by several people about the status, and unfortunately, due to a number of circumstances, it's taken a little longer than I had optimistically hoped for, and I've been told over and over again, oh, that's quite normal, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. But doesn't look well that it will be out in time for Christmas shopping season, but early in the new year. So please do keep your eyes out for this. This project has grown into much more than just simply a companion volume to the DVD or to the documentary that Doug Hychek produced, and it has it has grown into more of a personal project. We sort of pulled the stops, and instead of restricting myself to the confines of the documentary, I put a lot of my own personal experiences and expanded upon many of the things. Maybe if I just advance, it'll work. There we go. The documentary had its shortcomings, I think, as all of you may agree, experiencing the constraints and expectations of of the Discovery Channel itself. But I think Doug accomplished a tremendous service in that he brought a lot of data right up onto the lab bench of many professionals, colleagues and others, some of whom were already somewhat actively involved, such as myself, in the research, but many who were new to the endeavor, but approached it with an open mind and although not in every instance drawing conclusive or even persuasive conclusions, nevertheless were very impressed with the scope and the spectrum and the depth. One of those accomplishments was the involvement of Dr. George Schaller. And not only did Schaller introduce the documentary, but he very graciously agreed to read the manuscript with the aim of recruiting him to write the foreword to the book. And we got the manuscript into his hand as promptly as I could, and the very next day he emailed me back and was just absolutely delighted. And he was about to leave for Asia and said, "Now, what do you need? Will 2 or 3 pages be sufficient?" He immediately sat down that weekend and wrote out the foreword. Was very positive in his comments. One of the things I really want to emphasize today, this evening, and in closing here, as the conference draws to a close, is that, from my perspective, tremendous advances are being made in the reception of this subject within the scientific community, while there is without a doubt the entrenched prejudice in many quarters of the scientific community. There are also many people, some who are well established, that are more open in their expressions of interest and encouragement and support for the ongoing research. I would strongly advocate that this is the course, that we hold true to the course and continue to make inroads into this arena in this fashion, by being as scientific in our approach to things, by being evidence-based in the dialogue and the speculation and conclusions and inferences that we make. Matt Crowley's presentation, as I said, was exemplary of the type of approach to these various questions that we should be pursuing, and that will continue to strengthen the position to shift this from the perceived realm of the tabloid, the occult, the paranormal, solidly into the realm of biological sciences. That's where the advances are going to be made. As you know, let me just bounce back here then. Jane Goodall made a very open expression about her interest and support for this topic during an NPR interview, which, to the surprise of her interviewer, another individual who may not be have as much name recognition to the general populace is Dr. Russell Mittermeier. Russ Mittermeier is not only president of Conservation International, but he's also the head of the board of the specialty group for primate conservation, and has personally been responsible for the description of at least 5 new species of South American primate, and there's another 11 or more yet to be described. And I had a really interesting conversation with him over the phone as he was inquiring as to my treatment at the hands of the anthropological community, and when I explained to him that the spectrum of responses, he was quite disgruntled with those negative aspects and expressed real enthusiasm for the prospect of pursuing this subject in a more serious way. And as some of you may know, he is, if not on his way now, will soon be on his way to Bhutan on a joint project of Conservation International and Disney to look for rare and elusive species in that part of the world, including the Yeti. Quite openly the Yeti, because Disney's interest is in promoting a new theme park ride at one of their institutions. But, you know, that's whatever works, yeah, wherever the money can come. And it was quite a sizable award that was made. All right, so Russell Mittermeier. So let's talk about hominoid feet for a little bit then. The hallmark of the adaptation of the hominoid foot, in particular, of all the other primates, is the possession of a powerful, grasping great toe, or hallux, opposite these long lateral digits, combined with a very flexible area of the instep, flexible joints in the area of the instep. This is an adaptation for what is referred to by those who study primate locomotion as a grasp climbing adaptation. Hominoids have limb proportions that are particularly suited for going up inclined or vertical supports, grasping those supports with this powerful pinch or grip. The flexibility of the midfoot allows the foot to function in a dual nature, with the anterior part, the distal part, functioning as a prehensile organ, a grasping organ, but with a loose coupling, a relatively mobile or flexible coupling with the proximal or posterior part of the foot, which is then the propulsive component. That's where the leverage is coming from, the fulcrum of the lever being here at this flexible mid-tarsal joint. Now that joint here in the chimpanzee foot can be seen right here between the calcaneus and the cuboid and the talus and the navicular. It's actually a compound joint between these four tarsal elements. And that's rather flexible. Now it's not a simple hinge. As you can see, it's rather complex. The navicular and the cuboid are actually bound together quite tightly by stout ligaments. These are somewhat planar joints, but they have a little bit of concaval convexity, but it's kind of like a shallow tongue and groove joint, very shallow. And the more shallow it is, the more rotation or pivot can occur at that point. And obviously the head of the talus fits into the navicular, almost like a little simple ball and socket joint, but the head is not as spherical as something like the head of the femur or the head of the humerus. All right, so it's not just simply a hinge, but there's kind of a pivot and a rotation that occurs there that allows the heel then to lever up. Well, the human foot has all those same individual tarsals, those same joints, but the configurations are different. And the foot has been fixed with a longitudinal arch that relies on greater stability within those joints to prevent that arch from collapsing. Now here's the distinction of the human foot is this arch. So basically the strategy here has been to incorporate the anterior part of the foot into the lever to increase leverage. But at the same time, this increased leverage by incorporating the anterior part of the foot has permitted the calcaneus to be shortened, so that now the pivot here at the ankle joint is further back, and so movement, translation of the heel through space translates into a much greater range of motion here at the distal part of the foot. So this is what we call a speed lever. So the human foot is not less adapted, it's adapted in a different way to a different mode of locomotion. Modern humans are uniquely capable of endurance, walking, and particularly running. We are running animals, not only in our biomechanical anatomy, but in our in our physiology. You don't see many chimpanzees running marathons. They're just incapable of doing that, both mechanically and physiologically. The primate foot, and here let's just use our imagination for a moment. You'll see this is not a typical chimp or a gorilla. Has a very different, well, not a very different. It has a A less modified foot retains more of the primitive condition of the generalized primate foot in that the midfoot is very flexible. This allows then the heel, when we're dealing with terrestrial locomotion on the ground, allows the heel to be elevated somewhat independently of the anterior part of the foot, rather than storing energy in the deep plantar ligaments of a concave foot here. Those ligaments store elastic energy on this convex surface, on the deep surface of the tarsals. Now, this aspect of the mid-tarsal break, as it's referred to, was recognized in observations by anthropologists interested in great ape locomotion many decades ago. But it hasn't. It's sort of an obscure concept that only really specialized students of primate locomotion, and particularly great ape locomotion, are really aware of. And I became all too keenly aware of that fact myself when discussing this aspect with some of my colleagues as it relates to the Sasquatch foot, as we'll see in a moment. Even some people that I was quite surprised, one being Dan Schmidt, Dave Dagelin's recent collaborator, was rather ignorant of the mechanics and biomechanics of the mid-tarsal break in the great ape foot. So it was obviously necessary to go back and document this feature with some of the modern tools that we have at our disposal, instead of just simple observation and sketches as appeared in literature from a number of decades ago. And so I collaborated with a former fellow grad student, Rashna Wunderlich, who was still finishing up at Stony Brook some years ago. And she had set up a system that could record the plantar pressures, the pressures underneath the foot of the, in this case, chimpanzees, as they walked over this pad. Now, this particular slide, if you're observant here, you'll notice the knuckles back here. This particular slide was taken from representative of some knuckle walking quadrupedalism, but it still is very similar to the data we were deriving for bipedalism as well. So it makes the illustration just as well. What you see here then is the contact of the foot early on in the footfall, primarily over the heel and down the lateral side of the foot, as chimpanzees typically do. Here you can see then the pressure register of that step, the initiation of that step. The hotter colors showing higher pressures, the cooler colors less extreme pressures. So here is the pressure concentrated under the heel, extending down the lateral side of the foot. As the step progresses, you can see it continuing down the lateral side. There's the head of the fifth metatarsal, the bone here on in the fifth ray, and then out into the little toe of the foot. That proceeds even further. Now we can see it moving across just a little bit here, other portions of the heads of the metatarsals. But noticing there's not a lot of pressure here even remaining on the toe. It's light, almost non-existent, light. But right here is the key. Here we see now the heel elevating off the pressure pad and flexing here at the mid-tarsal joint. So now the heel pressure signature is absent. The hot spot now is right here on the lateral side of the foot beneath the cuboid, which was that bone just immediately in front of the heel bone. And then the chimp obviously has this widely divergent great toe that kind of sticks out there like a strut. And of course, in this instance, where the individual is walking quadrupedally, here's where one difference might arise, in that most of the weight by this time is already on the arms and the other foot now, which has already made contact well before the toes are leaving the floor here. And so there's actually very little pressure, just a little point there at the end of the big toe. Well, my question was, would these pressure patterns, would they translate to distinctive features, artifacts of the footprints themselves? Could we see evidence of this midfoot flexibility in a footprint? And so I made arrangements and went back to Stony Brook again, where these chimpanzees are well habituated to these kinds of exercises and actually enjoyed the exercises quite a bit, given their current situation in life. We set up just a real simple apparatus. It's just a little bit of lumber with a staple gun attaching some thick visqueen and some nice clean sandbox sand. And then the chimps were brought then to this holding area, and the trainer would lead them across the sand, and then the idea was we were going to take them over to a holding pen, and I would then be allowed to enter, take my pictures and measurements, rake the sand clean, and then allow the chimp to make another pass. I couldn't be in the enclosure at the same time with the chimps. This is Jason, by the way. And so, as I said, just a short aside here, Jason really enjoys interacting with his trainer and with other researchers. And this is playtime as far as he's concerned. He really enjoys going through these experiments. But he wasn't used to this routine. And the first thing we found was that sand was a real novelty to him. He didn't know what to think of it, and he'd walk up to that sandbox and he'd bend down and touch it with his lips and stick his fingers in it. And the first 2 or 3 times that the trainer, she'd hold some treats up high, and so he'd stand bipedally, he'd go walking along, and instead of stepping in the sand, he would go and sidestep it. Took about 10 minutes of training, quickly caught on, and with a little bit of play and interacting in the sand, he realized it wasn't so bad. It was nice and cool and felt good on his feet. So she led him across, down and back on a pass, and then indicated for him to go into the holding pen. Well, wait a minute. When he's thinking to himself, when I go into the holding pen, that means playtime's over and I have to go back to my enclosure. So he went to the opposite corner of the enclosure, didn't want to go in at all. And it took a lot of coaxing and lots of treats thrown in, Fruit Loops, Sweet Tarts, Smarties, Kool-Aid and squirt balls, all kinds of things that makes this enjoyable for him, or adds to the enjoyment. Finally he did, and he sat there attentively watching, munching on his goodies as I came around in through the side door, quickly took pictures, made my measurements, and then took a small rake and began to rake the sandbox fresh and clean in preparation for a second pass. So he comes out and very cooperatively makes the second pass, and the trainer indicates the holding cage. Well, he looked at the holding cage, he looked at her, he looked over at me, standing there patiently waiting by the side door. He walks over to the sandbox, and with his own fingers, he rakes all his footprints clean. So he's thinking, I can do that. I don't have to go back in there. I'll just do it for you, So it took a little unconditioning to get him to do that. But before I leave that, notice the arrangement here of these steps, and this is quite interesting. It's not exactly pertinent here, but it does bear on the transition to the human form, and that is that the great toe, notice how these steps sort of line up with one another, and that the great toe is lined up with the line of progression. It's rolling off of that great toe. The long toes, the long curved digits, are sort of pushed off to the side or angled off to the side. The transition to the human foot was not so much the great toe lining up with the remaining toes from a divergent position. It was bringing the lateral toes in line with the hallux, with the great toe, which brought the foot into what's referred to as a supinated position, which just naturally raises up the medial border of the foot and instills an arch, and then a fixation of the bones through the reconfiguration of the axes of rotation and the joint surfaces so that they would lock in that position more readily. And we'll see some of the characteristics of those bones that emerge later in the fossil record. Well, what I found was a little bit disappointing, but in retrospect it wasn't that surprising that the signature of this mid-tarsal break didn't show up very well, very distinctively in these sandboxes. And it was largely due, I believe, to this complication of the divergent toe. But every once in a while we would get a footprint like this that did suggest some translation of material pushed back in the form of a pressure ridge, or in this case a pressure disc, behind the mid part of the foot. And here you can see the big toe sticking out here and the very poorly impressed lateral digits with little compression under the toes because they simply don't press on those toes. They're just sort of curled up, sticking there off to the side. Well, that brings us then to the hominid fossil record. What does this provide by way of insight into an interpretation of the famous Laetoli tracks that date to nearly 3.5 million years ago? Well, as you can see here, here's a nice photo that appeared in National Geographic. The reconstructions typically show 2 individuals. In reality, there were 3. The footprint on the right side of the trackway consisted of 2 sets of tracks that were superimposed, with the trailing individual partly, sometimes and partly not, stepping almost directly in the footprints of the individual that had walked ahead of that, which is not too odd when you think about. Well, that was strange. The screen just fluttered and it made it look like they were starting to walk across the. I didn't put a movie in there. Oops. That got my attention. I'll say that. But you can imagine, when you're walking, say, well, I see this throughout the winter. I have to park across the playing field from our building, and so it's only recently that they've finally put in sidewalks alongside the field so that can be plowed. Otherwise, we'd be walking across through the snow. And rather than strike out independently through fresh snow, if there's already footprints, you walk in the footprints that are there. Well, this was probably a pretty strange and unusual substrate to these two hominids, and they were probably striking out across there rather tentatively. And it doesn't surprise me at all that the second individual crossed over or followed right in the footsteps, literally, of the predecessor. This is not too far of a stretch either, this notion of there being physical contact between the two, because these prints, and they're only slightly smaller, the single row, the footprints are only slightly smaller. They appear a lot smaller in a lot of the illustrations you might see because the overlapping prints don't perfectly register, which elongates them considerably in some instances. But the distance, if we can call it a straddle, although straddle usually refers to the distance between the right and left feet of a single trackway, but the distance between these 2 trackways only varies by about a centimeter or 2 at any point. So it strikes me as unlikely that this individual was walking along later and just walking alongside the already laid down footprints of a preceding individual. It's rather tempting to suppose that they were in some kind of physical contact because the distance between the line of travel of those 2 tracks is so remarkably coincident. But as you can see, here's a reconstruction by one artist, anthropologist, Maternus, and there is a bit of divergence of that toe. There is quite a bit of space that allows for some material to be squoze up between those 2 toes, between the first and second toe. As was pointed out, there has been considerable debate about, and unfortunately, some of it's driven by political agenda, and some of it's driven by poor observation or interpretation or lack of experience with both human and non-human primate trackways. I think most have backed off of the position that these look just like human footprints, although one of the contributors to the volume I just recently edited on bipedalism took a diametrically opposite position to my interpretation, and remains to be seen what he will ultimately decide. In any case, irregardless of those nuances of interpretation, there was a feature that jumped out to my eye that hadn't been addressed by any previous investigators. And these appeared in published photos from the Laetoli trackway. I haven't had the opportunity, obviously, and very few have had the opportunity to examine the actual footprints themselves. but there are a number of stereo photos, and I had the chance to go to Berkeley and look at Tim White's excellent set of stereo photos, 2 sets in fact. The trackway runs essentially north and south, and he took a set from when the sun was in the morning sky, so shining from the east, so side-lit from the east, and then he waited until late in the afternoon and took another set with the sun coming from the west. And those 2 complementary sets brought out a lot of detail in the stereo pairs. But here was an artifact or a feature, this ridge of material positioned right here. And as I initially drew attention to this, I was told, oh, that's just an excavation artifact, or oh, that's just a termite burrow. Sometimes what appears to be extrusion around the foot is actually a termite burrow. They would burrow through this ash, and when they would hit the compacted ash under the footprint, they would make a sharp turn and just follow the contour around and then resume their progression through the ash. Well, that's the point, though. They never would burrow under the compacted ash. They would take the route of least resistance around the footprint. And there were multiple examples of this ridge falling precisely in the same area. So we'd have to envision, termites marching perpendicular to this trackway and just happening to intersect the footprints at that particular location. The other thing that suggested that this might be a dynamic signature of the movement of this foot came with the reconstruction of the afarensis foot by White and Sua, his graduate student Gen Sua. And there's controversy about this particular reconstruction that revolves around their use of a portion of the foot of a hominid that didn't appear for another 1.5 million years. But nevertheless, the overall proportions are probably rather reasonable. The point was that when you create this scaled reconstruction of the foot and they superimposed it over this very photograph, the transverse tarsal joint, which is indicated here by the red line, falls just immediately anterior to this artifact, this feature, suggesting to me again that this is a mid-tarsal pressure ridge. It was further suggested by this cast that Tim White at Berkeley had in his collection, because right here is a very prominent ash or a flow front. This ash was probably quite wet and rather plastic, and again, I'm quite confident that this is not an excavation artifact, because there are footprints in which, although on this one the toes don't register very clearly, in several the impression of the great toe was very clear. The wet material extruded up through the gap, the prominent gap between the first and second toe, and then toppled over and had a nice rounded edge where it had slopped over, which had exactly the same appearance as this flow front. So this suggests that pressure here over the anterior part of the foot is extruding material backward into the heel after the heel has been elevated and pressure transferred forward. Now, a human foot just doesn't do this because of that fixed arch and the pivot being transferred forward or moved forward to the ball of the foot. When a pressure disc or pressure ridge is evident, it's typically right behind the ball of the foot, or sometimes you'll get a sort of a kickoff depending on the action of the toes and how much flexion is taking place behind, especially the big toe. But right here, never back here through the midfoot region. Now, Dr. Daglin has suggested in his book that the pressure ridge, which we'll see an example of in the footprints from the Patterson-Gimlin film site, find their equivalent in human footprints in a sandbox. And so here's the example that he published in his book, which is just absolutely not comparable in any way. This is a large pressure disc that has been pushed up from right behind the ball of the foot, clear up here, all the material transmitted or displaced backward, humped up from that point of pressure, not from flexion at a mid-tarsal pressure ridge. No comparison whatsoever. Now, and again, this was has taken a bit of repetition and explanation to get some of my colleagues to take a look at this, but more and more of them are now acknowledging that not only by examination of the footprints, but recent reevaluations of the tarsals of the foot, of afarensis, of Homo habilis, have all suggested midfoot flexibility. And so we're getting corroboration both from the skeletal elements and from the footprints. So if we can assume for a moment that the first bipeds were walking on flat, flexible feet, when did the modern human form emerge in the fossil record? Well, there's a scant record of the foot of early hominids through time. There's a tremendous gap after some of these early Australopithecines and early Homo in the form of Homo habilis, dating to about 1.8 to 2.5 million years ago, the OH8 foot. And then the only other footprint evidence that we have through this time period, until we get to Neanderthals, is this this footprint that comes from a site in southern France, the site of Terra Amata, which dates to about 800,000 years ago. This is the only published photo of that footprint, and I have yet to have to realize the opportunity to go over and examine the originals. Been in long, protracted conversations with Dr. DeLumley, and there is a long and ceremonial dance that takes place, especially when you're crossing international boundaries with sometimes with these types of collaborations, and especially with the older school. And it hasn't materialized into an invitation to come to his lab yet, although we're still talking. But this is the photo, and it can be seen in the Time, Life, Nature series under the volume The First Men, which deals with Homo erectus. Well, for those of you that have spent some time looking at Sasquatch tracks, that could pass as a pretty good Sasquatch track in many respects. There is a pretty good, well-differentiated big toe, but much like the Australopithecine tracks at Laetoli, the lateral toes have not impressed very well. There's obviously not a lot of compression under that part of the foot. Instead of there being a nice distinctive ball giving the foot sort of an hourglass appearance with a well-defined arch, there's a long convexity here, concavity in the footprint, reflecting a flat foot, and then here's the hump with this ridge right in that position, elongated heel back here. That appears to me, and obviously this is tentative until we have the opportunity to look more closely at this footprint, but that looks like a pressure ridge. So this suggests that even at a time when the Nearicotome Homo erectus is exhibiting limb proportions that are absolutely human. These limb proportions, in fact, the hind limbs take it into the extreme of human intermembral indices or limb proportions. In the upper range of the proportions that are found in equatorial populations today, where the adaptation is to elongate the limbs to increase surface area to mass ratios as an adaptation for heat dissipation. So many of my colleagues have simply looked at limb proportions. That limb proportions are without a doubt very correlated and very interrelated with locomotor strategies. But there are other aspects to proportions of appendages that have to do with other ecological selection pressures, such as thermal regulation. So, but many of my colleagues have looked at this and said, well, they've got limb proportions like humans, they must have walked just like humans, even in the absence of any foot bones for this specimen or just about any other Homo erectus. There is one that I'm aware of. There are two bones, one of which is a halluceal metatarsal, the long bone of the big toe in the instep, which looks remarkably like a Neanderthal, except it is very gracile. It's not robust. It's not thick for its length, which is a hallmark of the modern human foot, where the emphasis is then placed on pushing off with that big toe. So this, combined with that gracile big toe, suggests that maybe they weren't walking quite like us, that the modern human arched foot has not yet emerged in the fossil record, and that what we see here are adaptations for thermal regulation in a tropically adapted hominid. But when we get to about 400,000 years ago, and this is a specimen of Homo heidelbergensis, a species sort of interposed between, interposed between Homo erectus and anatomically moderns or Neanderthals if we're in Europe. This is Jin Shan. First said Jin Shan man, but in fact it turns out it's Jin Shan woman, based on analyses of the pelvic structure. But in contrast to the predecessors, the examples of fossil Homo erectus, we have virtually a replete foot. Now, I apologize for the lack of clarity, but again, this slow process of having fossils studied and published is vexing at times, and this is another case in point. The only illustrations of this have come from a popular Chinese magazine, and so the enlargement loses a bit. But having said that, there's still a lot of information that can be gleaned from that. Foremost is, here's the cuboid, and here's the calcaneus. Remember I said that in the chimpanzee, those joint surfaces are almost planar, with just sort of a little bit of a relief creating a pivot joint. Well, here we have much more a condition much more like the modern human condition, in which there's a big, long projection, a process, the calcaneal process that fits almost like a tongue and groove joint here underneath the calcaneus. And as the foot elevates forward onto the ball, those bones twist, and those overlapping surfaces come into a close-packed position and create stability for that joint, creating a very rigid lateral column for the foot as a jointed or as an arched structure. You can also see that the navicular here is very thick, in contrast to the condition in early Homo and Australopithecines, in which and chimpanzees, in which and other great apes, in which the navicular is very, very narrow. We don't have a well, yeah, we do. I'm sorry, over here. We don't have it here, but here's the hallucio-metatarsal. It is quite robust, big and thick. You can see the disproportionate size of the phalanges, the toe bones of the great toe, as opposed to the lateral toes. So by this time, by at least 800,000 years ago, these hominids were effectively walking like us. But the point is that for at least 3 million, and if bipedalism gets pushed back as far as 5 to 7 million years ago, with the initial advent of the hominid radiation, bipedalism on flat, flexible feet was a relatively stable adaptation, with a few modifications. We're finding much more diversity in modes of bipedalism amongst hominids than was appreciated before. But essentially, bipedalism on flat, flexible feet was the way hominids moved for at least 3 and maybe as much as 5 million years. And that the modern human skeletal anatomy, with our gracile, lightweight skeletons and the arched foot and adaptations for speed and endurance running and walking, are a very early innovation, or excuse me, a very recent innovation, probably anywhere between 200 to 400,000 years ago. All right, now I realize that there are some resonances with the presentation yesterday, with Mr. Pai's presentation, on some points, but only on a few points. And obviously the interpretation of those resonances is markedly different here. So the question is, do we have any other, is there a living analog? If an adaptation that was efficient for that length of time, we find in nature that convergence is rampant. Nature solves similar problems in similar ways, even sometimes starting from different points of departure or origin. Well, as we look at great apes, there is certainly a marked tendency for greater degrees of terrestriality if we go from something like a gibbon to a chimpanzee to a lowland gorilla to a mountain gorilla. And with the increase in terrestriality, we find a reduction in the length of the lateral digits and a greater degree of alignment of the lateral digits with the great toe. So, you've probably all seen chimpanzees at zoos. You haven't ever seen a mountain gorilla in a zoo, but this is a cast of a mountain gorilla foot, and you can see the remarkable approximation of the toes there. Now, this toe can abduct or diverge to a greater degree than this particular posture captured in this cast. And you can see sort of the bunched up, flexed skin here. But nevertheless, these gorillas oftentimes walk with their great toe lined up. I found a remarkable degree of idiosyncrasy. When I was working with the chimps, there were two chimps. And one of the chimps, not with the sandbox, but we did also some kinematic studies where we were looking at the foot from various angles, just to see to quantify this mid-tarsal break. One of the chimps always walked with the big toe aligned with or with the lateral toes aligned with the big toe, and the big toe always still pointing forward. The other always consistently, the whole time we were observing him, walked with the toes greatly diverged. I did some research at the Hogle Zoo in Salt Lake City looking at gorilla tracks in fresh snow, and there was a large male gorilla who walked with a real strut, big silverback, and his toe just stuck out at 90 degrees. These are lowland gorillas. And then there was a much more cautious female gorilla who walked in the snow much more tentatively with her hallux lined up with the other toes consistently, and was able to get casts of both of those conditions. All right. There we go. So that brings us to the Patterson-Gimlin film, which provides a really unique opportunity to examine this proposition that indeed we have a condition in which a modern analog of this form of bipedalism exists, of efficacious bipedalism on flat, flexible feet, which probably is not a shared trait with early hominids, but if indeed Sasquatch is derived from Gigantopithecus, then it would be more likely that bipedalism evolved independently in this very large terrestrial ape, and that the superficial resemblance of the Sasquatch foot to the human foot arose convergently, simply as the toes became more aligned. And as I'll point out, there are still some very primitive retentions of this foot that are similar to those of some of the early hominids, but could just as easily have arisen from a basic hominoid foot plan independently in temperate forest environments in northern Asia during the Pleistocene. Basically, I mean, Grover has often taken a lot of flack for his speculations about bipedalism in a primate that's known simply from a couple of jaws and a few thousand teeth with not a single postcranial bone. But if you stop and think about it, well, first his argument about the placement of the neck between the rami of the mandibles is a pretty rational explanation. But even setting that aside, if you're as big as Gigantopithecus, you are restricted to the ground. And once on the ground, there are only two ways to locomote. You either locomote quadrupedally or you locomote bipedally. And given the constraints of the rearrangement of the shoulder girdle of hominoids for overhead arm functions and arm hanging and so forth, the flattening of the chest, lateral broadening, the movement of the scapula to the posterior so it's no longer lined up with the humerus, those things place considerable constraints on supporting body weight with the forelimbs. And so bipedalism seems like a pretty reasonable alternative, much better, in my estimation, than a 50-50 chance of bipedalism over quadrupedalism. All right. Then, of course, we've got Hieronymus' suggestion that which has ranged from comments that the feet of the costume were like those big floppy Bigfoot slippers you used to get at Kmart, to some sort of prosthetic device indicated here. And as obviously now, as we've seen, I think Owen made a very convincing case for a somewhat modified view facial appearance of the face of the film subject. Obviously, this is reverse engineered from the prevailing assumptions about the appearance of the face of the film subject. And I would add, there's just another aside, but I've got to point this out because it keeps getting perpetuated. There was a discussion on the internet at one point about the opposable thumb of the film subject. And there is a frame, the 352 frame that was provided for publication apparently by Rene from his copy of the film had a smudge. It had a spot on that frame that fell right over the hand. And many people have interpreted that circular smudge as fingers and a thumb, almost like it's making an OK sign, with the palm facing completely posteriorly. Well, if you look at the Bortsev reconstruction, that hand is in the proper position. The palm is never facing completely posteriorly. It's facing medially in towards, and the fingers are somewhat curled up. In some frames, they are more extended. But the thumb is never pointed back like that. And yet, when Bob Hieronymus does his patty walk, what does he do? He sticks his hand back like this. He's copying the more widely circulated frame of 352 ignorantly, without realizing that that's not the hand at all. It's a blemish on the film frame. All right, so here's Roger. This apparently was taken after they got back to Yakima, but these are the right and left prints. And then this is a modified version of a picture that was taken by Rene. Also, I don't know if Chris mentioned that he has Rene's copies of those tracks that were made by impressing the originals into some substrate, sand or whatever. And they're worth looking at because and I'll come back to this in a moment, but the copy of this footprint here that now is widely circulated is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy that has been remolded a number of times. And you need to bear in mind that a latex mold, especially a thin latex mold, will shrink. And I can, anyone stops in my lab, I'll show you the undeniable examples of that. If you have created a mother mold to support that latex mold, after some time you'll find that your latex mold doesn't fit the mother mold anymore. And I'm talking a shrinkage of up to about anywhere from 6 to 10%. And so the copies that are out and about of this are quite a bit smaller, and oftentimes haven't been filled in as completely. And if you look at these prints over here, they're much fuller looking, much blockier than many people realize. And Chris was concerned about the 14.8 inches. This foot was measured as 14.5, but that's a rather conservative measure. 14.8 would be better. This one, from the very tip of the toe to the back, is fully 15 inches in length. So your 14.8 isn't out of line. And we've seen many different iterations. Here's mine of this picture. This is a very clear print that M.K. Davis provided me with. And then here's just a blow-up of that. And this is one of my photos of Bob Titmus's, one of his original 10 casts made at the film site. Even more than some of the others, this one really shows the toes extended very nicely, and so the congruence is even more marked. I mean, even aspects like you can see the prominence of the head and the base of the metatarsal there, which show up on the inner part of that cast quite well. Emphasize that flexion crease right there that corresponds with the ball of the foot. Or, well, let's not call it a ball, because that's one thing that's missing from the Sasquatch tracks, is a well-differentiated ball. This area we would call the ball is just, it's not differentiated as such. It's a broad area here. But the joint that is at the base of the big toe lies right here. You look at the heel, this one is impressed more deeply than this one is. Bob was running out of plaster, and so he was quite ingenious, though, in making that plaster go as far as he could to get the 10 tracks. And so many of these originals are nothing but shells where he splatter-coated and backed with toilet paper and then carefully lifted these out. They're like eggshells. And in fact, on some of these you'll see how they actually broke, and you can see the toilet tissue pointing through. So we don't have a full fill of the impression here, which makes it look narrower. As Don can attest to, he showed us a track where he did the very same thing. He had a deep imprint of his foot and then a shallow one, and laid them side by side. All right. So here you can see how delicate they've broken across here. Here, this is actually toilet tissue showing through the plaster, where it's flaked off. And then, of course, this is the one with the very prominent flexion, mid-tarsal pressure ridge, which is suggested in a number of these, but just not as marked. So here's what's happening. Again, just if it hasn't quite sunk in yet, let's one more time. The heel comes off, weight's transferred to the anterior part of the foot. That takes not just the ball of the foot, but the entire anterior part of the foot takes up the pressure, so it's more widely distributed. But if the substrate is plastic enough, if there's enough forward momentum and rearward impetus, then some of that material will be compressed and pushed back up into the heel region. The human foot just won't do that. There'll be a convexity here left that corresponds to the arch, but that's not a pressure ridge. And if a pressure ridge or a disc occurs, it's usually right here. Now, this also brings us to the question of the toes. The toes don't contribute so much, if at all, to the forward impetus. The pressure's coming from here, and this has to do with the flex-compliant gait, the Groucho walk, and so on, but I'm running short on time. Now, here was my effort. I took a shot at taking some photomicrographs from John Green's film as well, and had some success, kind of contrasty here, these particular prints, but just didn't have the time to follow through, and John was eager to get this done, and obviously Rick was much better qualified. But you can see here the heel coming up off. Here you can see it even better. Here's the heel. Now there's a little bit of obscure, the view is obscured of the whole foot in contact with the soil by some intervening relief here, but you know about where the foot is, and that heel is sticking up in the air here without a doubt. And I was able to finally get MK's attention directed to this. Here's one more. Heel sticking up. Okay. And then, of course, here's the whole series that Chris showed one example of the appearance of the plantar surface of a chimpanzee to alleviate the concerns over the light-colored feet on this individual. And indeed, if you look carefully, there are numerous frames in which the palm of the hand gets the proper orientation, that it's catching the sunlight, and is just as white as the soles of the feet appear. It's just it's never as fully directed towards the viewer and doesn't have that dramatic appearance. But it's just the reflectance. All right, now here's a little clip that MK put together to show in motion now this heel movement here. You can see the mid-tarsal break. I mean, you can see this dynamic happening in the film itself. This is not a stiff foot. This is not a floppy Kmart slipper. This is an animate foot. All right, I've looked for other examples. These were tracks that I witnessed firsthand outside of Walla Walla. Very pronounced or obvious mid-tarsal pressure ridge with the expansion cracks in these areas here. This was one that was inundated with water a bit, but you can see the mud flow back here. Here's the heel imprint, and then weight taken up here and pressure forcing that mud back into the heel. Now here's another one. There were instances that I had noted on the film that showed not only the mid-tarsal break during the stance phase, but during the swing you could see the flexibility of that foot. But it was with the copies and DVDs and VHS tapes that I had, it was difficult to get a good still. And so I was delighted when MK finally turned some attention to the foot and away from some of the other things that were being rather hotly debated. And he came up with some interesting, as you can see it here, here's one during the swing where you can see the flexion, the convexity of the foot clearly there. It's not a flat foot. Well, it's a flat, flexible foot, but the point is it's not a static prosthesis. Here's a color still of that. Okay, and then there's been this recurring concern about the projecting heel. And Dr. Daglin, the good Dr. Daglin, had the audacity, and I hate to speak negatively of my colleagues, but had the audacity to publish a ridiculous pencil rendering of this frame, and then to suggest that the Achilles tendon was inserting forward on the heel instead of posteriorly at the most proximal point of the calcaneal tuberosity. Well, in a good, clear frame provided by MK, you can see that there is a connection at the distal end. There's just a nice contour there because the plantar flexors are relaxed. And the tendon is relatively slack right now. And it is displaced back. I mean, look how thick that ankle is. Okay? The Skookum cast provided a very interesting insight into this anatomy. Very broad heel here, and this marked calcaneal tendon. This was very interesting to me because in chimps, the muscle fibers come all the way down to the heel. Humans are unique, well, for now, recognized as being unique in having a well-developed Achilles tendon, which is an elastic storage mechanism that's driven largely by the stiff arch. Well, this doesn't have an arch, but it has a very elongated heel, a more extremely elongated heel that can drive some of the elastic storage in that tendon. Here's a Rick Knowles heel cast from an impression to show the anatomical similarity, and then this shows very nicely this hollow, this concavity anterior to that Achilles tendon. This is that hollow due to the elongation of the heel, which creates a void between the shin bone, the tibia, and the Achilles tendon. This was a really nice little blink GIF that shows the heads of the gastroc contracting as weight's going forward. And you can't quite see it. He's bumped the contrast up, but if you look carefully, you can see the toes here. We'll come back to another one in just a moment. But as the weight's going forward on the foot, the ankle's already plantar flexing. The calcaneal tendon is straighter and tighter as the heads of the gastroc. So here's that other blink one more time. Only this time, instead of looking at the mid-tarsal break back here, look at the toes. Well, they're dorsiflexed just as you would expect them to be at the latter part of the swing phase, and look how long they are.
Jeff, what's that circle that appears in the middle of the small of the back?
That I'm not sure. I don't know if that's just an artifact because there's a little blob of color right there too.
Could it be a muscle contracting in there?
Well, MK has shown some muscles that the contraction of the muscles might have caused the hair to stand or change its orientation just enough that it's diffusing the light. He has another little GIF that is really impressive because the back extends as the muscles contract. The buttock cocks back, just a little more sway back, and it's just, you can see the muscles ripple up. But anyway, I'm going to stay down here for the time being, and those long toes are what is really interesting because, again, for a long time, the gold standard interpretation of the Bluff Creek tracks were peas in a pod, short, stubby toes. So here, this is Roger's cast, and again, like I said, even though it's flat and looks somewhat featureless, it's not. It's very featured. You can see the toe stems excellently. Look at the articulation of that big toe. Here's the anterior part of the foot. Notice right here, there's a bulge right there. Now, if any of you have flat feet or know someone that has flat feet and walks very pronated, so the arch is collapsed, there'll be a convexity on the inner side of the foot. The extreme point, the apex of that convexity marks the navicular tuberosity. Now again, Dr. Daglin suggested that you cannot infer skeletal positions from a footprint. Baloney. Baloney. You can, if there is a convex, well, we know that if there's a flexion crease, the flexion crease is coincident with a joint. Look at your own palm. You have a flexion crease across your palm, bend your knuckles. That flexion crease lies right under your knuckle joint. If you have a flexion crease there, that'll correspond to the hallucio-metatarsal phalangeal joint right there. Here we've got the tuberosity of the fifth metatarsal. So if there is any type of prominence, and this is quite variable, even in human footprints, but if there is a prominence, like right there, and this one's slid up just a little bit, that's the base of the fifth metatarsal. And so we can position a lot of skeletal landmarks in a footprint like that. This is a track from Walla Walla that I cast, and you can see all this is the length of the fifth toe. That toe is in a 14-inch track is as long as my pinky finger. So that means that that individual has toes that are as long as my fingers and has prehensile capability as much in their feet as much as I have in my hand, with the exception of the opposability of my thumb. That's pretty prehensile. Here's and I realize this is just a rough average from a few specimens, but this is modified from an illustration from, again, from Sue and White, and showing a foot that has the tarsus indicated in a white bar, the third metatarsal in the black bar, and then the arrow with the arrowhead is the relative length of the phalanges of the third toe. And you can see that Sasquatch falls intermediate between a Australopithecine and modern Homo sapiens. And in fact, the toes are actually a bit longer if you take into account that Sasquatch has a disproportionately elongated calcaneus due to its large size. So these toes are pretty long. Here is that track, in fact, where we had the good profile of the fifth toe. And you can see it has a very deep impression. This is what I call a half track, where only the front part of the foot has made contact with the soil. You can see the pressure ridge pushed up behind. Here's my interpretation of what's going on here. This is a running Sasquatch foot, whereas you or I would run on the balls of our feet with our weight supported over the ball by virtue of the fixed longitudinal arch. A Sasquatch can't do that. It doesn't have an arch to support the foot there, so it flexes at the transverse tarsal joint, and we get the entire anterior part of the foot taking up weight and transmitting weight. Other examples of that, they started popping up all over the place. Here's one. This is the familiar Hereford track, but what's not so familiar is the associated half track. And if you line these up, you get a good congruence between the toes. And right here is just a piece of that broke out of the original, but the track terminates right there. Well, if you overlay that, follow that down, it's right across here. This bulge is the transverse tarsal joint. That actually has the calcaneocuboid joint. There's the base and the head of the fifth metatarsal. No real pronounced ball, this long sloping concavity. Looks like there's a little bit of an arch, and even chimpanzees can show an arch in a transitory fashion. But you have to look from track to track to track. If the arch isn't consistent, it's a flat, flexible foot. It's not an arched foot. All right, and then we've been talking about the Bosberg tracks, and despite the pall of association with Ivan Marks over that whole incident and all the shenanigans that took place in the wake of the Bosberg incident, these are some of the most stunningly, anatomically stunning footprints that are to be seen. If these are hoaxed, we might as well all go home, at least as far as the footprint story goes, because we won't be able to tell the difference between real and hoaxed footprints. Grover did an admirable job of inferring the skeletal anatomy, mistakenly referred to it as Talipus equinovarus, or clubfoot, which he thought might have been flattened by the extreme weight of this individual. It's possible, but it's rather unlikely. But there's a whole skew of syndromes that come under the title of skewfoot. And correct me if yep. And the subtleties of those various manifestations are only to be differentiated through radiographic examination of the orientation of the talus relative to the calcaneus and so on and so on. But where Grover went a little bit awry is he didn't recognize the transverse tarsal joint flexibility in these footprints. He did talk about an increase of flexibility, but hadn't related it back to this joint. And he assumed that if an animal of this bulk was walking relatively in a similar fashion to us, it would have to have increasingly shorter toes, or shorter toes than ours, to resist bending stresses imposed. Same reason we have short toes by comparison to chimps or Australopithecines. But the thing is, the beauty of this adaptation is the transverse tarsal joint spares the toes those bending stresses. because with the combination of the transverse tarsal joint, that midfoot flexibility, and the compliant gait, the weight is being taken up by the leading foot before weight on the hind or the trailing foot ever makes it out to the toes. So the toes don't impress. You know, sometimes you see the toes curl in to gain traction, but they're not pushing off. They're only gaining traction. And there'll be many times when the toes don't impress all the way. And I've suggested to some of you that have asked me about 3-toe and 4-toe tracks, if you look at the one 15-inch or 14-inch track of mine that I cast at Walla Walla, it looks like there's only 3 toes. But if you run your finger across where the 4th and 5th, you can just feel the impression of the 4th and 5th. They just haven't quite pressed in. But there's a nice, deep impression underneath the ball of the foot. So, and the other thing, and this was another little bit of icing on the cake, by finally seeing the originals of the Bosberg tracks, the copies, unfortunately, have some relief right here. Some elevation. The originals, this is more concave, and it's clear on the originals that the outline of the sole goes right along there. Now, Grover had interpreted this, the sole coming up like this, and interpreted this as the split ball. And so he placed the halluceal metatarsal phalangeal joint right up there. In reality, this is where the halluceal metatarsal phalangeal joint is. Out down here. In fact, I've got it just probably even a little bit far up there. But right about there. And then, you know, you have a nice row of the toes. But what that does is that creates these long toes, just like we see on Patty in that film, and on other tracks that have been looked upon more dubiously because they had, as Renee called them, sausage toes. Okay? It has to do with the degree of extension of the sole pad distally. And those individuals where the sole pad extends further, when the toes flex, the sole pad throws up a flexion crease. And quite frankly, you only see that in the few individuals at Bluff Creek film site, or excuse me, in the Bluff Creek region during that period, and expressed to varying degrees. I have yet to encounter a Sasquatch track elsewhere that shows that characteristic to that degree. It's just an idiosyncrasy. And we have those same idiosyncrasies in human populations. This is one that I had seen but was never able to get a good still, and MK did it. It came through again. Right there, as the foot's swinging forward, the shadow comes up because there is a concavity there. Okay? So after that mid-tarsal break with the convexity, in this case, in that first part of the swing phase, that stored elasticity in those plantar ligaments causes a recoil, and it bends. And then as the toes are dorsiflexed to help them clear the ground, and there's actually some abduction of the foot with the toes pointing out that's better seen from the posterior views. All right. So the long and short of it is that this is a foot that has an elongated heel that gives this unusual appearance that has caused so much consternation in the film. It has a flat, flexible sole and foot skeleton combined with relatively longer toes than we see in a human foot, which allows this animal to retain that, at least a degree of prehension. But it's taken that trend that we saw from chimp to mountain gorilla to a little bit further extreme to where the lack of divergence is more marked in the big toe. But the toes are still quite long and capable of a fair amount of prehension. An elegant adaptation for a biped adapted to broken, uneven, steep, mountainous environments, as opposed to hominids that have evolved to open, mosaic woodland, and then eventually savanna habitats in which they became more and more reliant on endurance walking and, more importantly, running in the pursuit of their game as a hunting strategy, I suspect. And then finally, in closing, acknowledgement to the late Dr. Grover Krantz and his pioneering work, and which I'm convinced has kept this subject under the consideration of the scientific community, or the scientific establishment, as he would refer to it. I would hope, though, that contrary to his expressions of frustration and the scientific community or scientific establishment in capital letters, as he expressed in his book that we engender more cooperative relationships with members of the scientific community and in recruiting their attentions. So thank you very much for your attention.